Thanks, Alex. Delighted to be back with you today. This is our 8th webinar in an ongoing series to show you how to use a MaxiFi planner to raise your living standard, reduce your risk, and improve your lifestyle. And today I'm going to talk about housing and how you can turn housing into an asset rather than a liability. And you'll see different ways we can do that. So the agenda is beginning with telling you how you can use MaxiFi Planner to figure out how much you're actually spending on housing. This is a lot more complicated and difficult to figure out than one might think, but the software can figure it out in literally a half a second. I'm then going to talk about the gain from downsizing your home. This is particularly relevant to older people who have children who've left the nest and are considering whether or not they should be staying in a big home or moving to something smaller. And when they move, they can move to a lot of places. And indeed, if you're of working age, you can work in a lot of places because we can now do remote work, and about 40% of us are doing that these days. And so that means you can really live anywhere and work everywhere. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about moving to low or no tax states. That's one of the options you have if you can live anywhere and work everywhere. So what else we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about whether you should rent or own. And in this context, I'm going to tell you about the tax break to home ownership. I'm going to talk to you about the value of prepaying your mortgage or just paying it off point blank if you can do that. I'm going to tell you a bit about reverse mortgages, the pros and the cons. I'm going to talk about releasing the trapped house value, your trapped house value that you would not be able to spend if you just stay in your house and die in your house, because you will not have sold it and not have reaped the money from selling the house to increase your living standard, your discretionary spending. And the last thing I'll talk about is using mortgages to hedge inflation and help you hedge longevity risk, help you deal with living much longer than you expect to live. So let me just start with by saying that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a government agency, does calculations about the share of our budgets that we spend on housing, and they estimate that we spend about a third. Typical household in the U.S. spends a third of their budget on housing. You may be spending a lot more or less, and you need to know how much exactly you are spending on housing, because that affects your decision about whether or not you want to change your housing strategy, whether you want to move, whether you want to downsize, whether you want to take in renters. All kinds of questions come up in this context. And understanding how much you're spending on housing is pretty clear when you're renting. It's your monthly rent payment. But if you own a house, it's much more involved, and MaxiFi can be used, as I mentioned, to very quickly get the answer. So I'm going to show you how you can do that by taking the case of a couple, Joe and Jane. They're 55. They live in Oregon. Their children are growing up and they're out of the house. They've got a 4-bedroom, $700,000 house. It's got they still have a $500,000 mortgage that they took out. The interest rate is 3.5%. It's a 30-year mortgage. They're both earning $100,000, and they each have $750,000 in their 401k. They're making $3,000 contributions, and the employers are matching them dollar for dollar those contributions. Each of the spouses is going to retire at 65, and they've got $50,000 in a checking account. So this is a upper middle class household, and let's just think about how much it is they're actually spending on housing using MaxiFi. here's the answer. If they were to sell their house uh, just outright, and uh, how much extra discretionary spending, let's assume they sell their house and they don't rent, they don't buy another house, they just are able to, if you like, live on the street and have higher discretionary spending over their lifetime. Well, it's a big number. It's $1.5 million that they're spending on housing, because if they actually were just to sell their house and not acquire any other type of housing, they'd be able to spend 1.5 million, and that's 44% of the lifetime discretionary spending that they're now enjoying. So we're talking about a major increase in discretionary spending, where they're able to basically sell and didn't need to expend any money on housing. Maybe they could just sell and move in with their relatives, for example. So let's now think about how the BLS would measure their housing expenditures. The BLS would look at the sum of expenses on the house, like the property taxes. I put in reasonable property tax amounts and reasonable insurance amount payment and maintenance cost. And so the sum of those three expenses plus the foregone interest, the fact that they could take the $700,000 asset, sell it, and then invest it, let's say they invested in 30-year treasury bonds, they could earn 1.5% nominal. So that's what the government says is really the housing expenditure this year, expenditure sitting in the house this year, the couple's foregoing earning 1.5% on 700,000, and they're also paying these fixed expenses for the house, those three expenses. So that's a chunk of money, but it only comes out to be 26% of what they're actually spending. The correct measure that we got from running MaxiFi was 44%. So if you don't get this, measure this correctly, you can quickly believe that you're spending a whole lot less on housing than is actually the case. Now, why does the conventional measure come in so low relative to the correct measure? Well, it's ignoring the trapped house value, the fact that they have this $700,000 house, and if they live in it right till the end, they can't figure out a way to tap into that trapped house value. They will not be able to spend the proceeds from the sale of the house. So that's the major reason that these two numbers differ so much. So anyway, the bottom line here is that you may be house poor and not know it, but MaxiFi can tell you very quickly. Now, if Joe and Jane downsize by half, their lifetime discretionary spending rises not by 1.5 million, but by 778,000. That's a 23% gain. So let's think about this for a second. This couple, middle class couple, upper middle class, have a four bedroom house, but they could move into a 2-bedroom house or a 2-bedroom condo, and if everything was half of what it is now, half the mortgage would be half as big, and property taxes half as big, and so forth. Well, they could get some money out of the house, and their lifetime spending would rise by $778,000, 23%. That's a very important increase. It's a huge increase. And that's what this couple needs to understand when I say they have to understand how much they are spending on housing, and then how much more they could get to spend on themselves on a discretionary basis, were they to make some adjustment in their housing decision here. The next slide says that, just summarizes this key takeaway that MaxiFi can calculate your true spending on housing, the gain from downsizing, but you could also look at the cost of upsizing. If this couple was not their current age, they might be more like 35, thinking about buying a first-time house, or maybe upgrading from a small apartment because they've just had some kids. And the question there is, well, look, if we do this, if we change our home, then we we're going to have to take a hit with respect to our discretionary spending, to our living standard. And how big is that hit? Can we afford this house? In other words, MaxiFi can be used to figure out whether you can afford the house. And I just want to kind of point out to people that are using the program, or maybe new to the program, exactly how you would make these adjustments to these inputs. So I've set up this base case where the couple's living in Seattle, in Oregon, and doing what they're doing. But I've set up these other profiles: selling their house immediately, half sizing, move to New Hampshire. I'll talk about that in a bit. Renting, prepaying the mortgage. And where you put these inputs in is under housing. If you go into housing here and you click on this, you see a summary of what was inputted already. But if I click on edit, I can change these inputs. For example, if I want to see really quickly what would happen if they were to live in New Hampshire, I just come here and I change the state that they're living in. And then I run a comparison report. I compare living in, well, I would set up, if I was trying to do a comparison, I would set up a separate profile like I have here for, New Hampshire, and then just change that one input. And then I would run, here's what I would do. Click on New Hampshire. You can see that the housing says that they live in New Hampshire, and I would just click on reports, and I click a comparison. I can compare this report, which is moved to New Hampshire, against the base profile, and get a whole series of results and see very quickly what this means. I'll show you, I'll show you that slide. But anyway, getting back to this housing input screen, it can allow you to change the state you're living in. You can change these for either even in the base profile or with a new alternative profile. You can specify that you're contemplating living in a different house. Or maybe you're a first-time home buyer and you're trying to compare this house versus that house. Well, you can put the inputs in and then do a comparison in two different profiles. You can specify the mortgage. What about additional monthly payments? If you want to prepay the mortgage, you use these input fields right here. You can specify a change in your house that you're going to, change it to in some year. And if you click on, let's say you want to buy a new house, click on own, you'll get all the set of inputs that you need to put in for your current house. And you can have a second housing change. You can change your house twice. That's and then you can also specify what will happen to the house if Joe or Jane die. So for example, and this affects how much life insurance the program is going to calculate. And we also have the ability to enter vacation homes, and can change those as well. So let me go back to the slideshow and point out that, again, 42% of us are now working remotely. And so where we work and where we live can be completely independent. I'm kind of an example of that. I'm a professor at Boston University. That's my main job. And I'm currently living in Providence. We just moved to Providence. I'll tell you about that move in a moment. And I'm not, at this point, going into work. I'm working remotely. I have all my meetings, faculty meetings, meetings with grad students, seminars that I have to attend, and teaching. I can do it all remotely, and I am doing it all remotely. It's not as much fun, for sure, but this may go on, and it may be that because of COVID, a lot more of the work is done remotely in the future than would otherwise have been the case. And housing is potentially a lot cheaper, even just an hour away. I learned this personally. In July, my wife and I moved from Boston to Providence. We had a small condo in Boston, downtown Boston, and like so many people in the country, we were getting claustrophobic and wanted to have a little more space. So we found this house in Providence that is a small house. It's 60% more space though, and that doesn't include the basement and a backyard. So, but the surprising thing is that we were able to get 60% more space for half the price. In other words, so we sold our condo in Boston, and it took half the sale value to buy the house in Providence that has 60% more space. So you can tell that house prices are a lot cheaper. They're literally a third as expensive in Providence as they are in Boston for the same quality housing. And I had no idea that this was the case, that this price differential was this large. Because if you live in, let's say, as I was in Boston, you hear about what prices are in the surrounding communities, like Brookline is right next to Boston, and Cambridge is across the river. And you have the sense that these places are just as expensive as downtown Boston. And in fact, if you go out 10 or even 15 miles outside of Boston, outside of Center City, Boston, prices are pretty much the same as they are downtown per square foot. But if you go further out, if you go to Providence, which is just 50 minutes away, man, they're dramatically different. And I didn't know this at all until we started looking a little bit more widely and found saw the house in Providence. So that's what I'm saying. Unless you look, you won't know. So definitely you want to look around. And so let's talk about Joe and Jane moving. I just told you about my moving with my wife. Well, what if they were to move and just buy the same house in a different place? So let's say they could buy exactly the same house or comparable 4-bedroom house with the same, annual costs of holding the house, living in the house. Well, again, their living standard would go up by the same amount as if they half-sized, as if they downsized to half of, if they stayed where they were in the same high-priced area and bought a house that was half as big, they get the same gain in their lifetime living standard, which is getting to spend $778,000 more. And that's, again, a 23% increase in their living standard. But this is actually even better because their housing consumption doesn't change. They still have a 4-bedroom house. Before we were talking about them going into a 2-bedroom house. Now they still have a 4-bedroom house so the kids can come for the holidays and stay with them. And that's an option. So if you think about downsizing, you might think about not downsizing, but just moving. And that's a way of downsizing in terms of cost, but not downsizing in terms of space. So I want to point out that the price differential between Boston and Providence is not an anomaly. It's not the only two cities where prices are dramatically different. If you look at Manhattan's price per square foot for its residential real estate, its homes and condos, we're talking 20 times higher than the price in Cleveland. In San Francisco, the price per square foot is 10 times higher than the price in Memphis. In the 10 most expensive large cities in the US, if you spend $250,000, you can get 600 square feet, very small living space. But if you go to the 10 least expensive cities, on average, you'll be able to get 2,500 square feet, more than 4 times as much square footage. So the price in the big cities on average is 4 times higher than in the least expensive cities. Well, you know, the more expensive cities are 4 times more expensive than the least expensive cities. Now, what if Joe and Jane do what I just referenced, move to New Hampshire? Well, New Hampshire has this nice feature that it doesn't have an income tax. The income tax rate is 0. And the income tax rate in Oregon, it's a progressive schedule, and Joe and Jane are in the 10% bracket. So they're saving a lot of taxes by moving to New Hampshire. What about sales taxes? Well, the sales tax in New Hampshire is 0. The sales tax in Oregon is 0. So if I run the couple moving, their living standard goes up by over $250,000, and it's a 7.8%, 8% increase in their living standard. So that's really important to think about. If you're going to move, maybe you want to move across state lines and move to a state where there's no income tax. If you live in Massachusetts, there's a pretty hefty income tax. It's not 10%. It's more like 5, closer to, you know, somewhat above 5%. But imagine you're living within a few minutes of the New Hampshire border. All you have to do is, you could literally pick up your house and move it across the border, get a, you know, buy a lot, and people do move their homes, and you could move it across the border, and your living standard might go up by 8% or even more, depending on what kind of a tax, you know, what kind of income you're earning, receiving. So where can you go where the taxes are really low? Well, there's 9 states out of the 51 states, I'm including the District of Columbia as a state here. There's 9 states that have no income tax whatsoever. Alaska, Florida, Nevada, New Hampshire, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Washington, Wyoming. These are all places with no income taxes. Now you have to be, you know, careful. You have to look at the sales taxes. So let's say the sales tax in the state you were moving to, and maybe in Texas, was 5 percentage points higher than it is in the state that you're currently living. Well, you'd want to divide your lifetime discretionary spending by 1.05 in order to get an apples to apples comparison, because the you know, things are going to be 5% more expensive in Texas because of the sales tax. That's assuming that everything, all your discretionary spending would actually be taxed in Texas, but it might be that they exempt things like food or clothing under a certain expenditure level. So it's important to do some research on state sales taxes when you're comparing one state versus another. And you also want to think about property taxes, but that would come automatically. You're saying, you're setting up an alternative profile. I'm going to move to Tennessee. I'm going to buy this particular house I've looked at in Tennessee. And you'll know the property taxes, you'll enter that in there. So the program would automatically understand that Tennessee has really high property taxes, if that's actually the case. I'm not sure. But these states need to get revenue from some source. New Hampshire has no income tax, no sales tax. They have high property taxes. Okay, now here are the key takeaways. Your housing market may be the entire country. If you can, again, work anywhere and work everywhere and work and live anywhere, then you could potentially look all over the country. And for that matter, you could look all over the world. You could, I could be working just as well in Hong Kong as in Providence at Boston University. I could telecommute from Hong Kong, and the only thing that would be difficult would be the hours. I mean, I have to be nocturnal, but you know, maybe I could get used to that. People do. If I really like to to live in Hong Kong, I could do that. It's exactly 12 hours difference in time. You want to stay in the housing market. You want to make sure first of all, you define what is your housing market. Oh, gee, I would never move there because it's too far from our kids, or it's too far from my friends, our friends. But so you can define your housing market, but then start looking at the prices all around your housing market, because you might be surprised that things are a lot cheaper. I had a 10-minute commute from where I was living to my office. Now it's a 50-minute commute. And I was a little bit nervous about commuting. I mean, the remote teaching and so forth has alleviated that problem for the short run, but in the long run, I'm going to have to commute more. But then I realized I can do a lot of work, have telephone conversations with my, on the phone, get a lot of work done that way. So, and then, you have to just weigh on the one hand and the other hand, and things were certainly came out towards, to moving to Providence. So once you have kind of found a house that you're thinking about in a different location, well, any other house is going to be in a different location, but maybe it's in a different state. Anyway, you just put that in as an alternative profile in MaxiFi, and you say, okay, here's this house. Here's how I feel about this house. Here's this other house. It's in a different place. Here's how I feel about that. But gee, here's the big spending differential or small spending differential. If it's small, maybe it's not worth it to move. If it's a big spending differential, maybe it is. This is how you make this decision, by seeing what you're giving up, the opportunity cost of not being able to spend as much on yourself and vacations, on all kinds of things, restaurants, concerts, clothing, helping your kids out, all those things. So that's what pricing options means. It means comparing your discretionary spending in the two places, but also evaluating how you really think about one house versus another. And it could also be a rental property that you're moving into. We don't have to be thinking about your owning here versus owning there. You could be renting here versus renting there. So that brings me to the subject of renting. How do you compare, let's say, owning house A with renting house B? Well, suppose you're in house A. You want to figure out how high the rent would have to be for your house in order to make you indifferent between renting and buying. I call that the break-even rent. So for Joe and Jane, I set up an alternative profile, and I said, Joe and Jane are not owning their house anymore. They're renting. So I gave them basically the same inputs as they now have, except that I have them selling their house immediately and renting. And I had them, I figured out by going back and forth, iterating, that the break-even rent was $2,271 per month. So if they had to pay that rent per month, their lifetime discretionary spending would be essentially identical. And you see that in this chart here, that these two columns are essentially the same height. So you can take your own house, if you own a house, and say, gee, what's the break-even rent? Let me set up an alternative profile and just assume I sell my house at the end of this year and I immediately rent. And how high does the rent have to be for me to have the same discretionary spending? Well, it's that number. Now suppose that rents for Joe and Jane for the same 4-bedroom house were $1,500 a month. Well, then it would be clear that they would do better renting, because if they could get the same house and a higher lifetime discretionary spending, if they're only spending $1,500 rather than $2,271 per month, that would be a better deal. Now, what if the rent was $4,000 a month? Well, then it would be clear that renting is very expensive relative to to buying or owning. And in some places, rents are much cheaper than owning, and in other places they're much more, they seem to be more expensive. In major cities right now, in the downtown, where people are trying to leave because they want more space, the rents are dropping. You can get a very fancy condo in Boston looking out over the harbor, and the first couple of months, the deal is they'll charge you no rent whatsoever. That's a way of cutting the rent payment. So rents are coming down in the center cities around the country. So anyway, that's how you would think about renting versus owning. And this is just summarizing, this slide is just summarizing, comparing home A, renting home A and buying home B, making that that comparison. Now, there is a tax break to owning, and I want to make this clear. So there is a bias in our system, our a system of taxation that biases things towards owning. So other things equal, you really want to be, you want to take advantage of this tax break. And the tax break doesn't have anything to do with mortgages. It used to be the case that mortgages would provide you with a tax break because you could itemize that the interest payments. Well, these days interest payments are low, but secondly, and we can still itemize, but the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 dramatically raised the standard deduction. So virtually no one is itemizing anymore when it comes to their mortgage interest payments. They're just taking the standard deduction. So being able to, itemize your mortgage interest is of no value. So you're not getting any tax break from the mortgage, and it's kind of worse than that. Mortgages are really tax losers. The because if you you don't get this tax break, but if you were to let's say increase your mortgage, maybe Joe and Jane were to increase their mortgage from $500,000 to $600,000, they take that extra $100,000 that they borrow on their house and they invest it in a comparably safe asset. The mortgage payments are perfectly safe, right? They have to pay 3.6% on this mortgage, right, for 30 years. What if they were to buy a 30-year bond with the $100,000? Well, they'd earn 1.5%, and that 1.5% is taxable. So even if they could earn the same rate as they borrowed, as they're borrowing at, which is 3.5%, even if they could lend, if they could invest at 3.5%, they'd have to pay taxes on the investment. So they borrow money, they don't get any break on paying the interest on the borrowing, but they then invest the money and they have to pay taxes on the interest they earn. That's the sense in which mortgages are a tax loser. And let me now talk to you about the real source of the tax break to owning. And the way to think about that is to think about Joe and Jane as having no mortgage whatsoever. Just keep mortgages out of the picture because they have nothing to do whatsoever with the house, the tax break to owning your home. The source of the tax break is that you're in effect renting your house from yourself, and you're paying rent to yourself in effect by sitting in your house. You can think about taking money out of your checking account and sending it to yourself, and now that's rental for your own home that you're living in, and then you would just deposit that back in the checking account. So you can think about, you're paying rent to yourself for sitting in your home, but that rental income that you're receiving is not, and we call that imputed rent in economics, it's not taxable. To see this a little bit more clearly, suppose you have an identical clone. Well, clones are identical by definition, but they're identical financially. In every respect, they're identical, including the fact that they have the same identical home. It's just across the street. So we've got my son Alex living across the street from his clone, whose name is Alex, and they have the same house. And initially, they're living in the same in their own homes that they own, but then they decide to rent each other's home. So Alex moves across the street, and Alex moves across the street, and they're paying rent to each other. Now, all of a sudden, when it comes to paying their taxes, they have to report that rental income to the IRS and pay taxes on it. So if they sit in their own homes, there's a lower tax obligation liability than if they rent from each other. So that's the sense in which the owning is tax advantaged. And again, it has nothing to do with your mortgage. And how big is this tax break? Well, it can be about 5% up to, I guess if you're a higher income household like this couple, it'd be about 3% of their lifetime discretionary spending is producing this tax break. So in general, we want to be owning homes rather than renting them. But in certain places and in certain circumstances, if you're only going to be working in a city for a year, there's big transaction costs of buying a home. Or if maybe you're a student and you're going to move to a different city for a job, and you want to rent. Anyway, the takeaways here: homeownership has a built-in tax break. The tax break's not connected to mortgages. Use MaxiFi to compare renting versus buying. You can calculate the break-even rent, and then you can compare the actual rent in the places you might rent with a break-even number in the house that you're either currently owning or thinking about buying. And that's how you can compare renting, getting a sense of whether renting is expensive or not compared to buying that house or staying in it. Now, I kind of just went through the explanation for why mortgages are tax losers, and they're financial losers because if Joe and Jane borrow the extra $100,000 and have to pay 3.5% interest on that borrowing, they can't earn 3.5% safely. They have to pay it safely, they have to pay it for sure, but they can't earn it for sure. So that's the sense in which it's a financial loser. And this raises the question of whether we really want to have mortgages if we can avoid them. And the answer is we really do not want to have mortgages if we can avoid them. And that brings me to the subject of prepaying your mortgage. Doing so is a great tax and financial arbitrage. It's in effect giving you a higher return. Paying off your mortgage is like an investment. Paying off any debt is an investment. It's just a different kind of investment. It's not like our typical investment like buying a bond, but reducing a liability, in this case a mortgage, is like having more bonds. It's like buying a bond at earning 3.5% in effect. And then there's the tax advantage as well. So because the mortgage is not giving any tax break and the investment is taxable, the income is taxable. So let's think about Joe and Jane prepaying their mortgage. What if they increase their payments from about $2,300 a month to $3,300 a month on their mortgage? Well, their lifetime discretionary spending goes up by $78,000. You can see it right there in the figure. That's a 2.3% increase in their discretionary spending, and that's you can think about it as a present value lifetime discretionary number, or you can think about them their annual spending that they get to do, their discretionary spending. It's going to be 2.3% higher for the rest of their life if they make this move, and that's between age 55 and age 100, because I'm running the program assuming that their maximum age of life is 100. So that's it's not an enormous increase, but it's not trivial. $78,000, they're each earning $100,000 after taxes. Joe and Jane, they don't make $78,000 after taxes in a given year. So this is as much as they make after taxes as one of them makes as each of them make after tax in a given year. So that's actually a pretty big number. Takeaways, okay. Paying off your high interest rate debts, whether that's a student loan or a car loan or a credit card balance or a mortgage, that's your best investment, bar none, in this environment right now. You definitely want to be considering paying off debts before you think about doing any other investing. And prepaying mortgages is paying off the debt. And you could even think about cashing out your 401k to prepay a mortgage. Right now, if you've been impacted adversely by COVID, maybe you lost your job or were furloughed, you're able to take withdrawals, I think up to $100,000 from your 401 from your IRA or perhaps your 401k, depending on the particular vehicle provisions of the employer, to prepay your mortgage. So I did an article on this for Forbes, a column. It's right at that URL. So these slides are going to be available at MaxiFi.com/webinars. The other 7 webinars are all posted there. You can view them if you haven't done so already. And this, so you can, if you can't jot this down right now, you'll be able to find that URL and take a look. Or you can just go to Forbes and just put in cashing out 401k to prepay to mortgage, my name, Kotlikoff, Forbes, and up will come this column. It's had over 500,000 views, and I was able, for this couple that I ran in that particular column, able to raise their living standard, their lifetime spending by about $100,000. Joe and Jane, it's about $78,000. This is worth really considering carefully with MaxiFi. Okay, what about the problem of trapped house value? So I told you that if the couple stays in the house, they're going to die without having sold it. It's a $700,000 house. They might be doing this keeping their house as a security blanket in case they need to buy into a nice nursing home. But it's an expensive way of kind of insuring yourself against old age, long-term care. It might be worth looking at long-term care policies and thinking about other types of risks that you're facing for which you're trying to keep this house intact, and seeing if you can't avoid those risks in some other way. Now, what's really trapped here is not the equity they have in the house. It's not the $500,000. They have a $500,000 mortgage, remember, and a $700,000 house. So they have $200,000 in trapped equity, but it's not really $200,000 that's trapped. It's $700,000. It's the entire value of the house, because that's what they're on a path to die without spending. They're on a path of dying and leaving $700,000 on the table. So it's a trapped house value that we need to think about. But everybody out there in the financial world talks about trapped equity. But to see it's not trapped equity, you can just think about Joe and Jane taking money from their 401k if they could withdraw it, let's say, hypothetically, and paying off their mortgage today. Well, their trapped equity, the difference between the market value of the house and their mortgage, that would go from 200,000 to 700,000, because the mortgage would go from 500,000 to zero. So the trapped equity would go from 200,000 to 700,000, but not much fundamentally would change if they were to do this. They would still die with a $700,000 house that they haven't sold, and that's kind of a waste of spending power. So what's trapped is not their equity, but their house value. And if they could get a hold of that $700,000 right now, that would represent about a 21%, permit them to have a 21% increase in their lifetime discretionary spending. So it's a big number that that's being trapped. And let's think now about how you might untrap your trapped house value. Well, one option is to take out a reverse mortgage. Reverse mortgage, you have to be 62 or over. You can basically, they do look at your equity in your home, the value of the house minus your any mortgage. Let's say that the couple here had no mortgage, they paid it off, and so they had a $700,000 of equity. Well, they could get either a lump sum payment on the reverse mortgage or a series of ongoing payments. And if they didn't move, they just stayed in that house, they wouldn't have to repay. And once they did die, their estate would have to repay, but just up to the value of the house. So if the the money that was handed to these people, it's accumulating. That's kind of the liability. And it's accumulating at interest, and there's also fees that are also accumulating at interest because basically not paying anything out of pocket until somebody dies or moves. And again, if you die, then your estate would get hit with a bill from the reverse mortgage company. They'd say, well, look, we gave this money to your dad or your mom or your parents. They just died. You owe us X amount of money because it's everything we gave them plus all the fees every year, accumulated up every year to the present at a high interest rate, higher than the mortgage rate, and the fees are significant. So the if this bill that is presented to the estate, to the kids, let's say, is bigger than the value of the house, well, the kids will just say, well, take the house because that's all we owe you is the value of the house, repossess it. And that's what will happen. Now, if you do have to move, you do have to repay right away. So here's the deal. If you don't move and you die late, you win. Yeah, your kids may not inherit anything with respect to the house, but you get to live in that house. You get to get this money from the reverse mortgage company, and you get to spend that money, and you got to live there in the house right up to the very end. And the bank will likely get your house, and that's that. You've actually beat the bank. But what happens if you have to move in, let's say, 10 years? Well, then you're going to have to repay all the money they gave you with interest at a very high interest, and that's going to leave you with less money to go for the next home that you're going to need to live in. Maybe you have to move because you're ill and you need to move into a assisted living facility, or maybe you have to move to be closer to your kids because they need your help, or they've had a grandchild, you want to be close to the grandchild. So what I'm saying is the reverse mortgages are risky business and expensive business. I would not recommend them unless you look very, very carefully at all the details in the fine print about what it is, and think carefully using MaxiFi to think about run scenarios where you get some money right up front, let's say, and you live to 100, you never have to repay, and that's one alternative profile. Another alternative scenario is you get some money up front, and you can treat that as a special receipt in both cases, but after 10 years, you have to move. And then you can ask the reverse mortgage company, how much would I have to pay in 10 years in today's dollars, or just in dollars, nominal dollars, if I were had to move in 10 years? They're going to have to give you an answer, and you can put that in the program as a special expense 10 years from now and see whether, how much worse off you are. And I think your lifetime discretionary spending will be lower, but maybe not. You have to see the riskiness of this, of being forced to move. And obviously, you may have to move after 2 years or after 20 years, so you can run different scenarios and get a feel for this. Now, there's other ways to tap into trapped house value. You could downsize your home, and now you've eliminated half the problem of having a $700,000 value of the home trapped, and now it's only $350,000. You could sell that, and Joe and Jane could sell their home at some point for the $750,000 and just rent. And the difference between what they'd have to pay in rent for the rest of their life versus the money they extract from the sale, they could spend and increase their discretionary spending. They could also get value out of their house by renting part of their house. That's kind of a way of like selling your house is you sell, kind of rent it to somebody else and you get the proceeds. Maybe if you're renting out half your house, it's kind of like selling at least temporarily half your house. Have your kids move in with you. And let them share the expenses. That's in effect like renting to your kids. What about a formal sale leaseback to your kids? You could write a contract with your kids. As far as I know, it would be legal, where you sell the house to your kids right now in exchange for them letting you rent the house on an ongoing basis, where they can never evict you until you die. So that would be a sale leaseback. Another kind of arrangement would be the kids make annual, the kids make annual payments to you called gifts. Kids give you money through time. And when you die, you leave the house to them. So you say, look, kids, I got this problem. I got this trapped house value, $700,000. I'd like to spend it. Give me the money. I'm going to give you the house when I die. I'm not sure when that's going to be. So there's some risk on your side and also on my side. But pay me along the way so I can have a higher living standard, because otherwise I'm going to sell the house and rent, and you won't get any benefit from this at all. So the deal can be struck so that both parties are better off. Another thing you can do is sell your house and buy into a retirement community. So trapped equity takeaways, trapped home value is the major asset worth untrapping. Reverse mortgages are expensive and risky. There's 7 other options I just went through to consider. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about very briefly here, and then we'll get to questions and answers, is rolling your own inflation-protected annuity using a mortgage. So I've been kind of down on mortgages. I said there were tax losers and financial losers in terms of the interest that you have to pay, but they do provide a good hedge against inflation. And so why am I thinking about mortgages as hedging inflation? Well, I'm thinking about somebody who might be cashing out or taking their retirement account money, maybe their 401k, maybe they've just retired, and they're trying to decide whether or not to take it as a lump sum or in fixed payments or as an annuity where the payments continue until you die. But if you die young, you don't get any, if you set it up as the simplest form of annuity, if you die young, you just don't get anything. You're dead, but your kids don't get anything, or nobody would inherit because the annuity works that way. But you get a higher payment because of the chance that you may actually die relatively young, and nobody would benefit. The money would just go to the insurance company. So anyway, this is a way to get a higher living standard. The return on investing right now is really low, but if you buy an annuity with your 401k, you can get a higher payout through time. But there's no company in the country right now, no insurance company that's marketing inflation indexed annuities, annuity payments that adjust every year for the actual inflation that occurs in that year. And consequently, if you buy an annuity, you're at risk. You might be getting a higher payment, but it's fixed in dollar terms. It's just a fixed number of dollars. And if prices skyrocket because the Federal Reserve has been printing so much money, and the country just moves into a high inflation environment, well, this annuity payment in real terms will be declining. So if the price of a hot dog goes from $5 to $500, that fixed annuity payment is not going to buy many hot dogs. Anyway, how do you protect yourself against that if you want to buy an annuity, get this higher stream of payments, but it's nominal? Well, one thing you could do is have a mortgage. If you have a mortgage, then you can win when inflation comes around at the same time as that you lose when inflation comes around. You would win on the mortgage side because you'd be paying the mortgage off in watered down dollars, but you'd be receiving watered down dollars on the annuity side. So if you, let's say we're thinking about taking out a nominal annuity, what you could do is also borrow against your house and mortgage, and then take the proceeds and invest those in inflation index bonds, which are called TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, which would be immune to inflation. And you would then have a nominal income stream, the annuity stream, and a nominal obligation stream, the mortgage stream that you have to pay. And inflation would hurt you and help you, and that's how you're hedged against inflation. So that's why I'm saying you're rolling your own or building your own inflation protected annuity this way. Even if you, you could, a simpler way to think about this is just maybe you just go out and borrow money on your house as a mortgage and just buy a nominal annuity. Well, you got the inflation protection, but the problem with this is that the mortgage interest rates are higher than you can earn in the underlying annuity, and there's also transactions costs. So I throw this out there, but it may not be something you'd want to do. I wrote a column about it with Forbes. Here again is the URL. But I want to think about this. If you're really exposed to inflation risk, think about maybe you don't want to pay off your mortgage. Maybe you want to take a bigger mortgage out and try and put the extra money that you borrow into something that's going to be kind of immune to inflation. That's not going to lose value when inflation occurs, and certainly inflation index bonds are examples of that. But unfortunately, the return on inflation, the real return on inflation index bonds right now is negative about 34 basis points, 34% of 1 percentage point negative. So these are very tough times for investors because the returns are so low. So the takeaway is mortgages are financial and tax losers, but they're excellent inflation hedges. They can help you protect the real value of a nominal annuity. Comparing alternative MaxiFi planner profiles with different inflation, mortgage, and nominal annuity assumptions, and so can show you the protection you can get from against inflation from having a mortgage or having a larger mortgage. So that's the formal presentation for today. The contact information, which will be, it's one of the slides here. You can get in touch with me if you want to email me at the email address at the bottom. You can just also love to have you follow me on Twitter. I write a lot, and I write a lot about personal finance for Forbes and other outlets. And you might want to read some of those articles. So I tweet whenever I publish something. I tweet it out, so you could learn about those columns that way, or become a friend of mine on Facebook or LinkedIn. And then I've got this website, Kotlikoff.net, where I post a lot of columns and more research articles you might have some interest in. So thank you so much for coming and joining us today. And now we're going to turn things over to Alex to fire some questions off to me, and I'll give the best answers I can. Thanks again.